Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, and allow your mind to drift into the cobblestone streets and timber-framed houses of centuries past. You are safe here, in your comfortable present, wrapped in the certainty of science and reason, as we explore a time when safety was a luxury few could afford. Imagine yourself walking along a muddy medieval road, the morning mist clinging to the hedgerows like ghostly fingers. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from distant cottages. In this world, 700 years ago, the thundering of hooves could mean only one thing: approaching through the fog. A knight in full armor, mounted on his mighty destrier, was not merely a warrior, but a living instrument of warfare, trained from childhood to kill with surgical precision. Tonight, we will explore why ordinary people, soldiers, and even fellow warriors would choose flight over fight when confronted by these medieval engines of destruction. Through 4 gentle segments, we will immerse ourselves in the daily reality of those who lived in the shadow of knightly power. We will follow the life of a particular knight whose story illuminates this brutal hierarchy. We will uncover the mysteries of knightly culture and archaeology. And finally, we will contrast the lives of common folk with those who held the reins of power.
If you want to help me to keep doing these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. It motivates and helps me keep bringing videos in this format. If you'd like to hear about a specific topic, leave a comment below, and I'll show you in the video when your topic is chosen. Picture yourself awakening before dawn in a small village nestled in the rolling countryside of 13th century England. The thatched roof above your head drips with morning dew, and through the single window you glimpse the gray light of another day beginning. The air inside your modest cottage is thick with the lingering smoke from last night's fire, mingling with the earthy scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Your bed is nothing more than straw and rough woolen blankets, but it has kept you warm through another night. As you rise and step onto the packed earth floor, your bare feet register the familiar cold that seeps through the walls of your wattle and daub home. Outside, you can hear the gentle lowing of cattle and the soft clucking of chickens pecking at scattered grain. This is your world, simple and predictable, bounded by the rhythm of seasons and the demands of survival. Yet even in these peaceful moments, there exists an underlying tension, awareness that your life hangs by threads thinner than spider silk. You step outside into the crisp morning air, and immediately your senses are filled with the sounds and smells of rural life awakening. The village baker has already begun his work, the sweet aroma of baking bread drifting from his stone oven. Women emerge from their homes, carrying wooden buckets toward the well, their footsteps creating a soft percussion against the muddy lanes. Children dart between the houses, their laughter bright against the morning stillness, while dogs lazily stretch and yawn in doorways. But listen carefully, dear listener, and you will notice something else woven into this pastoral symphony. There is a wariness in the way people move, a tendency to glance toward the horizon, to pause and cock their heads at distant sounds. For in this world, safety is never guaranteed, and the greatest threat does not come from wolves or bandits, but from those who are supposed to protect you. Imagine now the thundering that begins, as barely more than a whisper, a rhythmic vibration felt through the soles of your feet before it reaches your ears. The baker's hands still on his dough. The women at the well straighten, water buckets forgotten. Children stop their games and press close to their mother's skirts. Even the dogs sense the change, their ears pricked forward, hackles beginning to rise. The sound grows louder, unmistakable now, the heavy drumbeat of a warhorse approaching at full gallop.
Through the morning mist,
a figure emerges that seems to have stepped from the pages of nightmares. A knight in full mail hauberk, his steel coif glinting wetly in the pale light, mounted on a destrier that stands nearly 6 feet at the shoulder. The horse's hooves strike the ground like hammer blows, each impact sending tremors through the earth beneath your feet. This is Sir Garrett de Montfort, though his name matters little to you in this moment. What matters is what he represents, the absolute power of life and death that rides with every knight who serves the local lord. His mail weighs perhaps 40 pounds, each ring individually forged and linked to its neighbors in an intricate pattern that has taken skilled armorers months to complete. Beneath the mail, he wears a padded gambeson that absorbs the shock of blows, while his helm, though simple by later standards, protects his skull and face from the worst impacts. But it is not merely his armor that makes him terrifying. It is the years of training that have gone into creating this human weapon. From the age of 7, he has been schooled in the arts of war. His muscles have been conditioned to wield sword and lance with deadly precision. His reflexes have been honed through countless hours of practice against quintains and fellow knights. His mind has been shaped to see the world in terms of dominance and submission, honor and humiliation.
Watch how the villagers react as he approaches. There is no thought of resistance, no consideration of standing their ground. Instead, there is an immediate and universal response, as natural as breathing. They scatter. The baker abandons his bread and ducks into his shop. The women drop their buckets and hurry toward their homes. The children disappear like morning mist, vanishing into doorways and around corners with the practiced ease of those who have learned that visibility means vulnerability. You too feel the primal urge to flee, and rightly so. For this knight, like all his brothers in arms, is not merely a man in armor. He is a living instrument of warfare, trained from childhood to kill with efficiency and without mercy. His lance, when couched properly beneath his arm and backed by the full weight and momentum of his charging destrier, can punch through mail, gambeson, flesh and bone as easily as a needle through cloth. His sword, forged by master smiths and balanced to perfection, can cleave through limbs and crush skulls with surgical precision. But perhaps most terrifying of all is his training in mounted combat. While you have spent your life learning to plant seeds and tend animals, he has dedicated every day to the mastery of violence. He knows how to use his horse not merely as transportation, but as a weapon in itself.
The destrier has been trained to rear and strike with iron-shod hoofs, to bite and trample fallen enemies, to respond to the slightest pressure from its rider's knees, even in the chaos of battle. Consider the physics of what you would face if you were foolish enough to stand against such a creature. A knight and his destrier together weigh perhaps 1,500 pounds, moving at speeds that can exceed 20 miles per hour. The momentum generated by this combination is devastating, capable of bowling over multiple opponents and crushing them beneath iron-shod hooves. The lance tip, backed by this tremendous force, concentrates all that energy into a point smaller than a coin, creating pressures that no human body can withstand. Yet even if the knight's initial charge were somehow avoided, you would still face a warrior whose every instinct has been shaped for combat. His sword techniques have been drilled into muscle memory through thousands of repetitions. He knows how to cut and thrust from horseback, how to use his mount's height advantage to rain down blows from above, how to wheel and charge again if his first attack fails to find its mark. The villagers understand this instinctively, even if they cannot articulate the mechanical realities of knightly warfare. They know, through generations of bitter experience, that when a knight appears with violence in his heart, the only rational response is immediate flight. There is no shame in this recognition, only wisdom born of survival.
As Sir Garrett rides through the village, you notice how even his presence changes the very atmosphere of the place. The morning birdsong seems muted, as if the sparrows and larks recognize a predator in their midst. The air itself feels heavier, charged with the potential for sudden, explosive violence. Even the animals sense the change, the cattle lowing nervously in their pens, the horses in the village whickering and dancing sideways. But today, fortune smiles upon this small community. The knight passes through without stopping, his business lying elsewhere, perhaps at the manor house that sits like a brooding presence on the hill overlooking the village. His passage leaves behind a wake of relief so palpable you can almost taste it in the air. Slowly, carefully, the normal rhythms of life begin to reassert themselves. The baker emerges from his shop, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron. The women retrieve their scattered buckets and resume their journey to the well, though their movements remain quick and nervous. The children reappear from their hiding places, drawn by curiosity even as their parents call them close. The dogs settle back into their lazy morning postures, though their ears remain alert for any sign of returning danger. This is the reality of daily life in the medieval world, dear listener. Not the romanticized vision of noble knights and grateful peasants that later centuries would create, but a harsher truth.
The presence of armed men, no matter their supposed nobility, represents chaos barely held in check. The knight's code of chivalry, so celebrated in songs and stories, extends only to his equals. To those beneath his station, he owes nothing but the minimal restraint necessary to maintain the economic system that supports his privileged existence. Consider how this constant awareness shapes every aspect of life in the village. Farmers plan their work in fields close to home, where they can flee quickly if necessary. Merchants time their journeys to avoid known routes favored by knights and their retinues. Young women learn to make themselves invisible when armed men appear, understanding that their safety depends entirely on remaining beneath notice. The very architecture of the settlement reflects this reality. Houses are built with narrow windows and thick doors, more concerned with security than comfort. The church, with its stone walls and heavy oak doors, serves not only as a place of worship, but as a potential refuge. Even the village well is positioned where it can be quickly abandoned if danger approaches, rather than in the most convenient location. In your own daily routine, you find yourself unconsciously adapting to this omnipresent threat. You rise early, before the mist lifts fully, knowing that knights prefer to travel when visibility improves. You listen constantly for the sound of hooves, distinguishing between the gentle clop of a farm horse and the heavier thunder of a destrier.
You watch the horizon for the telltale dust clouds that might herald the approach of armed men. As the morning progresses and the village settles back into its routine after Sir Garrett's passage, let us examine more closely how different members of this medieval community have learned to navigate the dangerous waters of knightly power. Each person, according to their station and circumstances, has developed their own strategies for survival in a world where armed nobility holds the power of life and death over common folk. Consider first the village blacksmith, whose forge already glows red-hot in the growing daylight. His massive arms, strengthened by years of hammering iron, might seem to offer some hope of resistance against an armored knight. Yet observe how carefully he conducts his business when rumors spread of knights in the area. His hammer strikes become more measured, less likely to ring across the countryside and draw unwanted attention. He positions his anvil so that he can see approaching riders while he works, and keeps his most valuable tools hidden beneath loose floorboards that can be quickly covered with ash and coal dust. The blacksmith understands, perhaps better than most, the terrible efficiency of knightly weaponry. He has forged the very instruments of their dominance, understanding intimately how each piece of a knight's equipment serves its deadly purpose. The careful taper of a sword blade that allows it to slide between mail rings.
The precise balance point that makes a weapon sing through the air with lethal grace. The hardened steel points of arrowheads designed to punch through the finest armor. His knowledge breeds not confidence, but a deeper appreciation of why flight represents the only rational response to knightly aggression. When knights do visit his forge, requiring repairs to their equipment or new horseshoes for their destriers, the blacksmith adopts a posture of careful subservience. His eyes remain downcast, his responses brief and deferential. He works with unusual speed, understanding that prolonging such encounters increases the risk of some perceived slight that might trigger violence. The coins they pay him, though generous, burn in his hands like brands, a reminder of his complete dependence on their goodwill. Watch now as the village priest emerges from his small stone church, his brown robes rustling softly in the morning breeze. Here is a man who theoretically enjoys some protection from his holy calling, yet even he moves with the cautious deliberation of one who knows that religious immunity exists only at the whim of secular power. His hands, soft from a life spent handling parchment and prayer beads rather than plow handles, tremble slightly as he scans the road where the night passed. He clutches his wooden cross more tightly, a gesture that speaks to spiritual comfort, but also to the very real fear that faith alone might prove insufficient protection. The priest has seen too much to harbor any illusions about knightly piety.
He has blessed the weapons of men who would use them against the innocent. He has heard confessions that detailed acts of brutality committed in the name of honor and feudal duty. He has performed last rites over victims whose only crime was being in the wrong place when a knight's temper flared. His prayers for peace carry the weight of desperate necessity rather than mere spiritual longing. In the manor house kitchen, where servants prepare the morning meal for their lord and his family, the atmosphere carries a different quality of tension. Here, proximity to power brings both privilege and peril in equal measure. The cook, a woman whose skill has earned her a measure of security, nonetheless jumps at every unexpected sound. She knows that her position depends entirely on pleasing those who could order her death with no more thought than they might give to swatting a fly. The kitchen maids move with practiced silence, their soft shoes making no sound against the stone floors. They have learned to make themselves invisible, to anticipate needs before they are spoken, to avoid any action that might be interpreted as presumption or disrespect. Their eyes remain downcast when knights visit the manor, understanding that even accidental eye contact might be seen as invitation or challenge, either of which could prove fatal. These servants live with an intimate knowledge of knightly temperament that the village folk, for all their fear, cannot fully comprehend.
They have witnessed the casual cruelty that can emerge when men trained for war find themselves bored or frustrated. They have seen kitchen boys beaten unconscious for spilling wine, stable hands flogged for failing to curry a destrier to perfection, and chambermaids dismissed without reference for some imagined slight. Their survival depends on maintaining absolute invisibility while performing visible service, a paradox that requires constant, exhausting vigilance. Beyond the manor walls, in the fields that stretch toward the distant forest, agricultural laborers pursue their ancient rhythms with one eye always on the horizon. The morning mist that clings to the furrows provides some psychological comfort, offering the illusion of concealment even when true safety remains impossibly distant. These are men and women whose bodies bear the marks of endless labor, whose hands are permanently stained with soil, and whose backs curve from years of bending to their tasks. Yet, observe how even their most basic activities reflect the omnipresent threat of nightly violence. They work in groups whenever possible, knowing that multiple witnesses make casual murder more difficult to explain away. They position themselves near hedgerows and stone walls that might offer momentary concealment or impediments to charging horses. They carry crude horns fashioned from animal bones, instruments that can raise a general alarm when danger approaches. Their tools, while primarily agricultural, are arranged so they might serve as improvised weapons if flight proves impossible, though all understand the futility of such desperate measures. The women of the village face additional layers of vulnerability that color every aspect of their existence. The unmarried daughters learn to walk with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes, making themselves as unremarkable as possible. They understand that beauty, rather than being a blessing, represents a potentially fatal liability in a world where knights take what they desire without consequence. Their mothers teach them to dress in drab colors, to bind their hair severely, and to cultivate skills that keep them indoors and out of sight. Marriage itself becomes a form of protection, though an imperfect one. A husband's presence, however humble his station, provides at least the illusion of ownership that might give a predatory knight pause. Yet even married women move through their daily routines with constant awareness, avoiding isolated areas, traveling in groups when possible, and maintaining mental maps of every hiding place and escape route in their vicinity. The elderly members of the community carry perhaps the heaviest psychological burden of all. Having lived through decades of arbitrary nightly rule, they possess the clearest understanding of how quickly peaceful coexistence can transform into nightmare. Their memories stretch back through wars, raids, and casual acts of violence that have shaped the community's collective trauma. They serve as informal historians of atrocity, passing down through whispered stories the knowledge necessary for survival. These old ones gather in the early morning darkness before the rest of the village stirs, sharing information about night movements in the region.
They trade rumors about which nobles are in residence at nearby castles, which roads have become dangerous, which seasons traditionally bring increased military activity. Their conversations, conducted in voices barely above whispers, weave together intelligence networks that rival those of kings and princes in their importance to common survival. Children in this environment lose their innocence with heartbreaking speed. By the age of 5 or 6, they have learned to distinguish between different types of horses by sound alone, to recognize the visual signatures of approaching armed men, and to respond to parental warnings with instant, unquestioning obedience. Their games reflect this harsh education, involving elaborate scenarios of hiding, escaping, and avoiding detection by imaginary knights. Yet, even in this climate of perpetual fear, life continues with remarkable resilience. Couples fall in love and marry. Children are born and nurtured. Communities celebrate religious festivals and seasonal changes. The human capacity for adaptation allows people to find joy and meaning even in circumstances that would seem unbearable to modern observers. However, this joy remains forever shadowed by awareness of how quickly everything can be destroyed by the whim of an armed nobleman.
They must walk a careful line between displaying enough prosperity to conduct business effectively and avoiding such obvious wealth that they invite confiscation or extortion. These merchants develop elaborate strategies for concealing their assets, maintaining multiple caches of goods and coins hidden throughout the region. They cultivate relationships with various lords simultaneously, playing competing interests against each other to maintain some small measure of independence. Yet even their most careful planning cannot entirely protect them from the capricious violence of knights who recognize no authority beyond their own desires and the distant approval of their feudal superiors. Artisans and craftsmen occupy a similar position of vulnerable visibility. Their skills provide essential services that even knights require, offering some protection through utility. The village carpenter knows that his ability to repair castle gates and construct siege engines makes him valuable enough to warrant protection from casual violence. The weaver understands that her fine cloth satisfies the vanity of noble ladies, creating a network of aristocratic patronage that shields her from the worst depredations. Yet this protection remains conditional and temporary. A craftsman who displeases a knight through poor work, excessive pricing, or simple bad timing can find his protection evaporating like morning mist. The very skills that normally ensure survival can become liabilities if they attract the wrong kind of attention or create unrealistic expectations among the nobility. As the sun climbs higher and burns away the last traces of morning mist, the full scope of this medieval community's adaptation to nightly dominance becomes clear. Every aspect of life, from the timing of daily activities to the architecture of buildings, from the education of children to the strategies of survival employed by the elderly, reflects the fundamental reality that armed nobles represent an existential threat to common folk. This is not the romantic medieval world of later literature and song, but a harsher place where survival depends on invisibility, where wisdom lies in retreat rather than confrontation, and where the thundering of hooves heralds not rescue but potential disaster. In such a world, the decision to flee rather than fight when confronted by a knight represents not cowardice, but the highest form of practical intelligence. As the afternoon sun reaches its zenith and casts sharp shadows across the village lanes, we must delve deeper into the invisible wounds that knightly dominance inflicts upon the collective soul of medieval society. The physical threat posed by armored warriors represents only the most obvious layer of oppression. Beneath the surface lies a complex web of psychological trauma, cultural adaptation, and spiritual compromise that shapes every aspect of human existence in this feudal world. Listen carefully to the conversations that take place in the village tavern as the day progresses toward evening.
The building itself, constructed of thick oak timbers and fieldstone, seems to huddle against the earth as if seeking to make itself invisible. Inside, the atmosphere carries the weight of collective memory, each whispered story adding another layer to the sediment of fear that has accumulated over generations. The tavern keeper, a man whose face bears the permanent lines of chronic worry, serves watered ale to customers who speak in voices barely above murmurs, as if the very walls might carry their words to unfriendly ears. Here, in these hushed conversations, you begin to understand how deeply the reality of nightly violence has penetrated the consciousness of ordinary people. The stories they share are not the heroic tales of chivalric romance, but accounts of brutality witnessed, families destroyed, and communities scattered by the whims of armored lords. An old farmer speaks of a harvest feast disrupted by drunken knights who demanded tribute in grain and gold, then burned the granary when they deemed the offering insufficient. A miller's widow recounts how her husband met his death for the crime of grinding grain without first obtaining permission from the local lord's reeve. These narratives serve multiple purposes within the community's psychological ecosystem. They function as warnings, teaching younger generations to recognize the signs of impending danger. They provide a form of collective therapy, allowing people to process trauma through shared experience. Most importantly, they reinforce the fundamental lesson that survival depends upon understanding and respecting the absolute power differential between the armored elite and everyone else. Each story concludes with the same implicit moral. Flight represents wisdom. Confrontation ensures destruction. The psychological impact of living under such constant threat manifests itself in countless subtle ways throughout daily life. Children develop sleep disturbances, starting awake at night from dreams filled with the thunder of hooves and the gleam of steel. Adults exhibit the hypervigilance characteristic of prey animals, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, their bodies tensed for immediate flight. Even moments of joy and celebration carry an undercurrent of anxiety, as if happiness itself might attract the malevolent attention of those who hold power over life and death. Consider how this environment affects the development of moral and ethical frameworks within the community. Traditional concepts of justice become meaningless when knights serve as both judge and executioner, their decisions based not on law or precedent, but on personal whim and momentary mood. The village learns to internalize a different kind of morality, one based on survival rather than abstract principles. Lying becomes virtuous when it protects the innocent from nightly attention. Theft transforms into a noble act when it prevents resources from falling into the hands of armored oppressors. Cowardice evolves into the highest form of courage when it preserves life and community in the face of overwhelming force. Religious faith, that cornerstone of medieval existence, undergoes profound distortion under the pressure of knightly dominance. The village priest, despite his theological training, finds himself preaching a gospel of accommodation rather than righteousness. His sermons emphasize patience, humility, and acceptance of earthly suffering as preparation for heavenly reward. The concept of divine justice becomes relocated to the afterlife, since its absence in the present world remains so obvious and painful. Prayer itself transforms from petition to desperate bargaining, as communities offer their devotions in hope of avoiding the attention of wrathful nobles. Yet even these compromises provide insufficient comfort to consciences struggling with the reality of their situation. The priest himself suffers from what we might recognize today as moral injury, the deep psychological wound that comes from being forced to sanctify or remain silent about acts of clear evil. His private prayers, offered in the dark hours before dawn, when even God seems absent from the world,
carry the weight of accumulated guilt over his own complicity in maintaining a system that crushes the innocent beneath the iron heel of aristocratic privilege. The cultural impact of knightly dominance extends far beyond individual psychology to reshape entire patterns of social organization and artistic expression. Folk songs, those repositories of communal memory and identity, focus not on heroes and victories, but on clever escapes, successful deceptions, and the wisdom of knowing when to run.
The traditional ballads speak of peasants who outwit cruel lords through cunning rather than force, of communities that survive through mutual aid and collective vigilance rather than individual heroism. Artisans and craftspeople develop aesthetic sensibilities shaped by the need to remain invisible to predatory nobles. Their work emphasizes function over beauty, durability over decoration, and most importantly, the ability to be quickly hidden or abandoned if circumstances require sudden flight. The village potter creates vessels that can be buried in soft earth without breaking. The weaver chooses patterns and colors that avoid attracting covetous attention from aristocratic women. The carpenter designs furniture that can be disassembled rapidly and transported by cart to new locations. Even the rhythm of seasonal celebrations adapts to accommodate the reality of knightly power. Harvest festivals, traditionally times of communal joy and thanksgiving, become subdued affairs held in secret locations away from main roads. Wedding celebrations, once elaborate public displays of community solidarity, transform into quiet ceremonies conducted with lookouts posted to provide early warning of approaching trouble. Religious holidays, theoretically protected by ecclesiastical authority, nonetheless proceed under the shadow of potential disruption by nobles who recognize no law beyond their own desires. The economic life of the village operates according to principles that would seem paradoxical to modern observers. Success becomes a liability rather than an asset, as prosperity attracts the predatory attention of knights who view commonwealth as an insult to the natural order. The traditional ballads speak of peasants who outwit cruel lords through cunning rather than force, of communities that survive through mutual aid and collective vigilance rather than individual heroism. Artisans and craftspeople develop aesthetic sensibilities shaped by the need to remain invisible to predatory nobles. Their work emphasizes function over beauty, durability over decoration, and most importantly, the ability to be quickly hidden or abandoned if circumstances require sudden flight. The village potter creates vessels that can be buried in soft earth without breaking. The weaver chooses patterns and colors that avoid attracting covetous attention from aristocratic women. The carpenter designs furniture that can be disassembled rapidly and transported by cart to new locations. Even the rhythm of seasonal celebrations adapts to accommodate the reality of knightly power. Harvest festivals, traditionally times of communal joy and thanksgiving, become subdued affairs held in secret locations away from main roads. Wedding celebrations, once elaborate public displays of community solidarity, transform into quiet ceremonies conducted with lookouts posted to provide early warning of approaching trouble. Religious holidays, theoretically protected by ecclesiastical authority, nonetheless proceed under the shadow of potential disruption by nobles who recognize no law beyond their own desires. The economic life of the village operates according to principles that would seem paradoxical to modern observers. Success becomes a liability rather than an asset, as prosperity attracts the predatory attention of knights who view commonwealth as an insult to the natural order.
Having witnessed decades of arbitrary violence and systematic oppression, they understand with crystal clarity how thin the veneer of civilization remains when confronted by armed force. Their memories stretch back through generations of trauma, creating an archive of collective pain that informs every decision and shapes every interaction. They serve as informal counselors to younger community members, offering guidance based on hard-won wisdom about survival in an environment where traditional moral categories provide little practical guidance. Yet even in this climate of perpetual fear and compromise, the human spirit demonstrates remarkable resilience and adaptability. Communities develop underground networks of mutual support that operate beneath the notice of aristocratic oversight. Secret codes and signals allow for the rapid communication of danger across wide geographic areas. Hidden caches of food and resources provide insurance against the inevitable demands of passing nights. Most importantly, systems of collective memory ensure that the lessons of survival pass from generation to generation, creating continuity and hope even in the darkest circumstances. The children born into this world develop psychological defense mechanisms that would be considered pathological in more secure environments, but represent adaptive responses to genuine existential threats. They learn to read adult emotions with supernatural accuracy, understanding that their survival depends on correctly interpreting the subtle signs of stress and fear displayed by their elders. They develop imagination techniques that allow them to mentally escape from unbearable present circumstances while remaining physically alert to immediate dangers.
As evening approaches and the village settles into the temporary safety of darkness, the full scope of nightly impact on medieval consciousness becomes clear. This is a world where the very categories of thought have been shaped by the omnipresent reality of armored violence. Concepts of justice, morality, success, beauty, and even love itself carry the distortions imposed by a system that places absolute power in the hands of men trained from childhood to view other human beings as objects to be dominated or destroyed. In such a world, the decision to flee rather than fight when confronted by a knight represents far more than tactical calculation. It embodies the accumulated wisdom of communities that have learned through generations of bitter experience that resistance leads only to destruction, while accommodation offers at least the possibility of survival. The shame that later centuries would associate with retreat finds no place in this medieval reality, where running away represents not cowardice, but the highest form of practical intelligence and community loyalty. The psychological weight of this existence presses down upon every aspect of daily life like a physical force, shaping posture and expression, influencing social patterns and interactions, determining the very architecture of hope and fear within the human heart. Yet still people love and laugh, work and worship, dream and plan for futures they pray their children might live to see.
The human capacity for endurance in the face of overwhelming oppression remains perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this harsh medieval world, a testament to the indomitable spirit that survives even when crushed beneath the iron heel of aristocratic privilege. Let us now turn our attention from the general terror of knightly dominance to examine the specific formation of one such warrior, tracing the methodical transformation of a child into an instrument of war. Through understanding how knights were created, we begin to comprehend why confronting them represented such a hopeless endeavor for ordinary people. Our subject is Sir William de Braose, born in the year 1197, to a family whose very name had become synonymous with ruthless efficiency in the service of the English crown. Picture, if you will, the stone keep of Bramber Castle on a cold February morning, its walls thick with frost that glitters like scattered diamonds in the weak winter sunlight. Within these walls, in a chamber warmed by braziers and hung with tapestries depicting scenes of conquest, a child takes his first breath in a world that has already determined his destiny. William enters life not as an individual with choices to make, but as a weapon to be forged, shaped, and sharpened according to the precise specifications demanded by medieval warfare.
His father, also named William, and known throughout the realm for his unwavering loyalty to King John, understands that the boy's survival and success depend entirely upon his transformation into an effective instrument of violence. There is no sentimentality in this recognition, no room for the tender emotions that might soften lesser men. The elder de Braose has witnessed too many aristocratic families fall from grace, their lands confiscated and their bloodlines extinguished to harbor any illusions about the nature of their world. Strength represents the only currency that retains its value across generations, and strength in the medieval context means the ability to kill efficiently and without hesitation. From his earliest moments of consciousness, young William absorbs lessons that would horrify modern sensibilities, but represent essential survival knowledge in his brutal era. His wet nurse, carefully chosen for her robust health and unwavering loyalty to the de Braose family, whispers stories of ancestral victories rather than gentle lullabies. The tapestries that decorate his nursery depict not mythical creatures or pastoral scenes, but detailed representations of siege warfare, cavalry charges, and the systematic destruction of enemy strongholds. Even his toys carry martial significance. Miniature swords crafted by the castle's finest smiths, wooden horses carved to resemble destriers, and castle models complete with working siege engines. By the age of 4, William begins to understand that his existence serves a purpose far greater than personal happiness or individual fulfillment.
He learns that he represents not merely himself, but the accumulated power and prestige of generations of De Bro's warriors who carved their legacy from the flesh of their enemies. The weight of ancestral expectation presses down upon his young shoulders like a physical burden, shaping his posture and his perspective with relentless consistency. His formal education commences at age 5 under the tutelage of Brother Marcus, a Benedictine monk whose scholarly demeanor conceals a thorough understanding of military strategy and political manipulation. The lessons proceed according to a curriculum designed not to broaden the mind, but to focus it upon the single consuming purpose of achieving dominance through violence. William learns to read using chronicles of famous battles, absorbing tactical principles along with literacy. His mathematical instruction revolves around calculating siege trajectories, supply requirements for military campaigns, and the optimal ratios of cavalry to infantry for various combat scenarios. Geography becomes a study of strategic advantages and vulnerable positions. History transforms into an analysis of successful conquest techniques and the fatal mistakes that led to military defeats. Even religious instruction emphasizes the divine mandate for aristocratic rule and the sacred duty of knights to impose order through force of arms. Brother Marcus ensures that William understands warfare not as a regrettable necessity, but as a noble calling that elevates those who practice it above the common mass of humanity.
At dawn each morning, regardless of weather conditions, William joins the castle's pages in exercises designed to build the specific muscle groups and reflexes required for medieval combat. He learns to maintain perfect balance while wearing heavy mail, to mount and dismount from a destrier at full gallop, and to wield weapons with either hand to compensate for battlefield injuries. The training regimen proceeds with scientific precision, each exercise calculated to develop particular combat skills while building the psychological conditioning necessary for effective violence. William learns to suppress natural human responses of empathy and hesitation, replacing them with instantaneous tactical assessment and decisive action. His instructors, veteran knights who have survived decades of warfare through superior skill and unwavering brutality, understand that mercy represents a luxury that no warrior can afford if he hopes to live long enough to sire the next generation of fighters. By age 7, William has progressed beyond basic physical conditioning to begin formal weapons training. His first sword, crafted specifically for his small hands by the castle's master armorer, weighs nearly 3 pounds and requires considerable strength to wield effectively. The boy's arms ache constantly during these early months of training, his muscles screaming in protest against the unnatural demands placed upon them. Yet he learns to ignore pain as completely as he has learned to disregard the cries of wounded animals during hunting expeditions. The progression of his martial education follows a carefully established sequence designed to build skills incrementally while maintaining psychological conditioning.
He begins with wooden practice weapons against stationary targets, learning to strike with precision and power. Gradually, he advances to combat against moving quintaines, mechanical devices that spin unpredictably and strike back when hit incorrectly. Eventually, he engages in controlled combat against other pages under the watchful supervision of knight instructors who intervene only when genuine injury threatens to interrupt the educational process. Each phase of training incorporates increasingly sophisticated lessons about the psychology of combat and the importance of projecting absolute confidence in the face of opposition. William learns that hesitation kills more warriors than superior enemy skill, that the appearance of invincibility often proves as effective as actual martial prowess.
His instructors teach him to cultivate a presence that intimidates opponents before combat even begins, understanding that psychological warfare represents the most efficient form of violence. The boy's education extends far beyond mere physical combat techniques to encompass the broader skills necessary for effective leadership in medieval society. He learns to read men's faces for signs of deception or rebellion, to project authority through posture and tone of voice, and to make the rapid life-or-death decisions that determine the fate of battles and kingdoms. His tutors emphasize that a knight's power derives not merely from his personal combat skills, but from his ability to inspire fear and loyalty in equal measure among those who serve under his command.
As William approaches his 8th birthday, his training intensifies to prepare him for the next phase of his development, service as a page in the household of another noble family. This transition represents a crucial step in his transformation from child to weapon, removing him from the familiar environment of his birth castle and placing him in circumstances where survival depends entirely upon his ability to demonstrate the skills and attitudes that have been so carefully cultivated. The selection of his future lord requires careful consideration, as the choice will profoundly influence the final shape of his character and capabilities. His father ultimately arranges for William to serve in the household of Earl Roger Bigod, a man renowned throughout England for his tactical genius and his absolutely ruthless treatment of enemies. The Earl's castle in Norfolk has earned a reputation as a finishing school for knights whose loyalty can be purchased only through the currency of demonstrated effectiveness in battle. The night before William's departure from Bramber Castle, his father summons him to the Solar for a final conversation that will shape the boy's understanding of his place in the world. The chamber, lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows across stone walls, provides an appropriately dramatic setting for the transmission of family wisdom accumulated across generations of successful violence. The elder de Bros speaks not with paternal affection, but with the clinical precision of a master craftsman, explaining the proper use of a carefully forged tool.
He tells his son that the world consists of only 2 categories of human beings: those who possess the strength to impose their will through force, and those who exist to serve the interests of their superiors. There is no middle ground in this medieval reality, no safe haven for those who attempt to avoid the fundamental choice between dominance and submission. William must embrace his destiny as a member of the ruling class or accept the inevitable fate of those too weak to claim their rightful position at the apex of the social hierarchy. The conversation continues deep into the night, covering topics that range from tactical considerations to political philosophy, all unified by the central theme that effective violence represents the foundation upon which civilization itself rests. The elder de Bros explains how their family rose from obscurity to prominence through consistent demonstration of superior martial prowess, and how they maintain their position through unwavering readiness to destroy anyone who challenges their authority. Most importantly, he emphasizes that knights serve not merely their immediate lords, but the broader principle of aristocratic rule that keeps the natural order intact. The peasants who flee at the sound of approaching hooves do so not out of cowardice, but out of instinctive recognition that they face their natural superiors. The merchants who offer tribute without resistance understand that their continued existence depends upon the goodwill of men trained from childhood to view commerce as a privilege granted by warrior nobles.
The priests who bless knightly weapons acknowledge the divine mandate that places military aristocracy at the pinnacle of earthly authority. As dawn approaches and the time for departure draws near, William receives his father's final blessing and his first adult weapon, a dagger whose blade bears the de Bros coat of arms and whose edge has been honed to razor sharpness. This blade, his father explains, must taste blood before his next birthday arrives, for a knight who has never killed remains incomplete regardless of his training or noble birth. The act of taking life represents the final initiation into the brotherhood of warriors, the moment when potential transforms into actuality and boy becomes man. The journey to Earl Bigod's castle unfolds across 3 days of travel through the English countryside, providing William with his first opportunity to observe the effects of knightly rule from the perspective of a future knight rather than a sheltered child. He watches how entire villages empty at their approach, how merchants prostrate themselves beside the road, how even fellow nobles carefully gauge the size and quality of their escort before deciding whether to offer greeting or avoid contact entirely. These observations reinforce the lessons he has already learned, while adding nuanced understanding of how knightly power operates in practice rather than theory.
He begins to comprehend that the fear he inspires derives not from personal reputation, which he has not yet had opportunity to establish, but from the simple fact of his obvious noble birth and martial training. The very sight of a young knight in training triggers responses conditioned by generations of violent encounter, creating a psychological advantage that exists independent of individual capability or achievement. Earl Roger Bigod's castle rises from the Norfolk marshlands like a stone predator, its towers reaching toward gray skies that seem permanently stained with the smoke of countless fires. The fortress represents more than mere architecture. It embodies a philosophy of power that transforms young nobles into instruments of royal will through systematic brutalization disguised as education. As 8-year-old William de Brose passes beneath the massive portcullis for the first time, he enters an environment designed to strip away every vestige of childhood innocence and replace it with the cold calculation necessary for effective violence. The great hall that serves as the castle's heart pulses with an energy both magnificent and terrifying. Tapestries depicting the Bigod family's military triumphs cover walls that have witnessed decades of political maneuvering and strategic planning. The Earl himself, a man whose scarred face tells the story of countless battles survived through superior skill and unwavering ruthlessness, regards his new page with the clinical assessment of a craftsman examining raw material. His eyes, pale as winter ice, miss nothing as they catalog William's strengths and potential weaknesses with scientific precision.
The boy's first lesson begins before he has even removed his traveling cloak. Earl Bigod summons him to approach the high table where the evening meal proceeds according to rituals that emphasize hierarchy and submission at every moment. William must navigate between the long tables where knights and men-at-arms consume their food with the casual efficiency of predators, their conversations focused on tactical considerations and the comparative merits of various weapons and armor configurations. The atmosphere carries an undercurrent of barely controlled violence, as if the assembled warriors might explode into combat at the slightest provocation. Standing before the Earl's carved chair, William receives his first direct instruction in the reality of his new existence. He will serve not as a cherished young guest, but as the lowest-ranking member of a military household where survival depends entirely upon usefulness and obedience. His noble birth grants him potential access to knightly status, but provides no protection from the harsh discipline necessary to forge effective warriors. Indeed, his aristocratic heritage increases rather than decreases the expectations placed upon his shoulders, for the Earl tolerates no weakness among those destined to carry the responsibility of leadership. The daily routine that governs William's life unfolds according to a schedule designed to maximize both physical conditioning and psychological transformation. He rises before dawn in a dormitory shared with 6 other pages, their ages ranging from 8 to 13, each representing a different stage in the systematic destruction and reconstruction of human conscience.
The older boys serve as both examples and tormentors, having learned that survival in this environment depends upon projecting strength through the domination of those weaker than themselves. Morning exercises begin in the castle courtyard while stars still glitter in the pre-dawn darkness. The pages engage in combat training that progresses far beyond the relatively gentle instruction William received at his father's castle. Here, wooden practice swords give way to blunted steel weapons that nonetheless inflict genuine pain when wielded with full force. The instructors, veterans scarred by decades of warfare, show no mercy to boys who demonstrate hesitation or excessive concern for their opponent's welfare. Pain, they explain, with clinical detachment, represents the most effective teacher available to those who hope to survive their first real battle. William's education extends far beyond mere weapons practice to encompass the broader skills necessary for medieval warfare. He learns to care for destriers whose temperaments mirror those of their knightly masters, magnificent, powerful, and absolutely lethal to anyone who fails to treat them with proper respect. The boy's hands, still soft from his sheltered childhood, quickly develop calluses from handling bridles, saddles, and the countless other implements necessary to maintain a knight's equipment in perfect fighting condition. The relationship between page and destrier proves particularly instructive in the psychology of dominance that governs knightly culture.
These horses, bred specifically for warfare, and standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, possess both the physical capability and the trained inclination to kill human beings who displease them. Yet they submit absolutely to the will of their knightly masters, recognizing through instincts honed by selective breeding that resistance leads only to destruction. William learns to project the same combination of confidence and controlled violence that knights use to dominate their mounts, understanding that the techniques proven effective with animals apply equally well to human subjects. His instruction in armor maintenance provides another crucial component of his military education. The complex systems of mail and plate that protect knights in battle require constant attention to remain functional, and William spends hours each day learning to identify and repair the subtle weaknesses that can prove fatal in combat. He discovers that a single broken mail ring can provide an enemy blade with access to vital organs, that improperly adjusted straps can restrict movement at crucial moments, and that neglected metal surfaces can fail catastrophically under the stress of battle. More importantly, the intimate familiarity with knightly equipment that develops through this maintenance work teaches William to recognize the vulnerability points in enemy armor, while simultaneously understanding how his own protection functions. This knowledge will prove invaluable in future combat situations, allowing him to target his attacks with surgical precision while minimizing his own exposure to enemy weapons.
The Earl's armorer, a grizzled craftsman whose expertise has kept generations of begode knights alive, takes particular pleasure in explaining how various weapon designs exploit specific weaknesses in different armor configurations. As William's first year in the Earl's service progresses, his training begins to incorporate increasingly realistic combat scenarios designed to prepare him for the chaos and brutality of actual warfare. Mock battles conducted in the castle courtyard evolve from carefully choreographed exercises to genuinely dangerous encounters where serious injury represents a constant possibility. The boy learns to function effectively while exhausted, wounded, and terrified, recognizing that these conditions represent the normal circumstances of medieval combat rather than exceptional situations to be avoided. The psychological conditioning that accompanies this physical training proves even more transformative than the development of martial skills. William learns to suppress the natural human responses of empathy and compassion that would interfere with effective violence. His instructors teach him to view enemy casualties not as fellow human beings, but as obstacles successfully overcome, their deaths representing tactical victories rather than moral failures. The distinction between necessary killing and unnecessary cruelty becomes increasingly blurred as the boy absorbs the lesson that mercy represents a luxury that professional warriors cannot afford. His first opportunity to apply these lessons in a real-world context arrives during his second spring at the castle, when Earl Bigode receives orders to suppress a peasant uprising in a neighboring shire.
The rebellion, sparked by excessive tax demands and arbitrary confiscations of property, represents the kind of low-level violence that provides ideal training opportunities for young knights in training. William accompanies the punitive expedition not as a combatant, but as an observer whose education requires exposure to the realities of aristocratic rule. The journey to the rebellious village proceeds through countryside that bears the scars of previous military actions.
Abandoned farmsteads dot the landscape, their timbers blackened by fires that consumed not only buildings, but also the dreams and aspirations of families who dared to resist noble authority. William observes how the mere approach of armored knights triggers immediate flight among the rural population, understanding for the first time the practical effects of the psychological dominance his training has been designed to create. The village itself, when they finally reach it, presents a scene of desperate defiance that impresses William with both its futility and its inevitability. Perhaps 36 peasants, armed with agricultural implements and crude weapons forged from scrap metal, have barricaded themselves behind overturned carts and hastily constructed earthworks. Their faces reflect the haunted determination of people who understand they face annihilation, but lack any alternative to resistance. Women and children huddle in the shadows of buildings, their eyes wide with terror as they contemplate the fate that awaits them. Earl Bigod conducts the assault with the clinical efficiency that has made him one of England's most effective military commanders.
His knights deploy in a formation designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing their own casualties, understanding that the rebellion's suppression matters less than the demonstration of knightly invincibility it provides to other potentially troublesome communities. The actual combat, when it begins, unfolds with horrifying swiftness and one-sided brutality that shocks William despite his years of preparation. The peasant defenders, for all their desperate courage, prove utterly incapable of offering meaningful resistance to properly trained and equipped knights. Their makeshift weapons shatter against mail and plate armor, their improvised fortifications crumble beneath the weight of charging destriers, and their untrained tactics dissolve into chaos within moments of the first contact. William watches in fascination and horror as men who have spent their lives growing food and tending animals attempt to fight warriors whose every waking moment has been devoted to perfecting techniques of human destruction. The slaughter that follows teaches William lessons that no amount of theoretical instruction could convey. He learns that courage without skill represents merely another form of suicide, that moral righteousness provides no protection against superior force, and that the gulf between professional warriors and amateur fighters renders resistance not merely futile, but actively harmful to those who attempt it. The peasants' deaths serve no purpose beyond demonstrating the consequences of challenging aristocratic authority, their blood soaking into earth that will soon be redistributed among more compliant tenants.
Yet the expedition's most instructive moment comes not during the brief combat, but in its aftermath, as Earl Bigod methodically executes the wounded rebels who survived the initial assault. William observes how the Earl's blade finds the gaps in makeshift armor with surgical precision, how each stroke delivers death with minimal effort and maximum psychological effect. The lesson proves unmistakable. Knightly skills, when properly applied, transform killing from crude butchery into elegant artistry. The boy's education continues through the systematic interrogation of captured villagers, a process designed to identify other potential sources of rebellion while demonstrating the futility of resistance to aristocratic rule. William learns to read faces for signs of deception, to distinguish between genuine submission and dangerous resentment, and to apply precisely calculated amounts of pain to extract information without rendering subjects incapable of providing it. These skills, his instructors explain, represent essential tools for maintaining order within territories under knightly control. The return journey to Bigod's castle proceeds through countryside that has received the message intended by the rebellion's suppression. Villages that showed signs of restiveness now display banners of submission, their inhabitants prostrating themselves beside the road as the nightly column passes. Markets that had been closed in solidarity with the rebels reopen immediately, their merchants eager to demonstrate their loyalty through generous offerings of goods and services. Even the weather seems to acknowledge knightly dominance, as spring sunshine breaks through clouds that had persisted throughout the punitive expedition.
William's reflection on these experiences occupies many quiet hours as he resumes his regular training routine at the castle. He begins to understand that his previous education, comprehensive though it seemed, had prepared him only for the technical aspects of knightly service, while leaving him unprepared for its moral and psychological dimensions. The systematic destruction of human life that he witnessed represents not an aberration, but the fundamental purpose for which knights exist, the core function that justifies their privileged position within medieval society. His instructors, recognizing the boy's psychological progress, begin to introduce more sophisticated concepts related to the strategic application of violence. William learns that the threat of destruction often proves more effective than destruction itself, that the careful cultivation of reputation can eliminate the need for repeated demonstrations of power. He discovers that the most successful knights achieve their objectives through psychological manipulation rather than brute force, understanding that fear represents a renewable resource, while human life remains ultimately finite. As William approaches his 13th birthday in preparation for advancement to squire status, his training intensifies to encompass the leadership skills necessary for commanding other warriors in battle. He learns to project authority through voice and bearing, to make rapid tactical decisions under extreme stress, and to maintain discipline among men whose lives depend upon his judgment. The Earl's most experienced knights take turns sharing the practical wisdom accumulated through decades of successful violence, each lesson purchased through blood and validated by survival.
The boy's final examination as a page arrives in the form of a hunting expedition designed to test both his martial skills and his psychological conditioning. The quarry, however, proves to be not wild game, but a group of bandits who have been terrorizing merchant caravans along nearby roads. William must demonstrate his ability to track human prey, engage in lethal combat, and execute prisoners without hesitation or remorse. His performance during this expedition will determine whether he advances to squire status or remains indefinitely in his current position. The hunt unfolds across 3 days of pursuit through dense forests, where every shadow might conceal an enemy, and every sound could herald either salvation or destruction. William learns to function effectively while sleep-deprived and constantly alert, to read signs in disturbed earth and broken vegetation, and to coordinate his movements with other hunters whose success depends upon absolute precision and timing. The bandits, desperate men driven to violence by circumstances beyond their control, prove far more dangerous opponents than the village rebels he observed during his first campaign. The climactic confrontation occurs in a forest clearing where the trapped bandits make their final stand against pursuers who have demonstrated relentless patience and superior skill. William, now armed with sharpened steel rather than practice weapons, engages in genuine combat for the first time in his life.
The moment when his blade first tastes human blood represents a transformation as profound as any religious conversion, marking his transition from potential killer to actual one. The bandit who falls beneath his sword dies not as a fellow human being, but as validation of years of careful training and preparation. The morning mist that clings to the castle battlements on William's 15th birthday carries with it the weight of destiny approaching fulfillment. 5 years of systematic brutalization have transformed the soft child who arrived at Earl Bigod's castle into something far more dangerous and infinitely less recognizably human. Standing in the armory, where he has spent countless hours maintaining the instruments of his future trade, William examines his reflection in the polished surface of a knight's helm and sees staring back at him the cold eyes of a professional killer. His advancement to squire status had marked not merely a promotion in rank, but a fundamental alteration in the nature of his existence. No longer content to observe violence from a distance, he now participates directly in the systematic application of force that maintains aristocratic dominance throughout the realm. His hands, once soft with childhood, now bear the permanent calluses and scars that mark a lifetime dedicated to the mastery of weapons. His body, shaped by years of relentless training, has developed the peculiar combination of grace and power that characterizes the medieval warrior at his peak efficiency.
The squire years had introduced William to refinements of violence that his earlier education could only approximate. Serving as personal attendant to Sir Geoffrey de Clare, one of Earl Bigod's most accomplished knights, he learned to anticipate the needs of a man whose survival depended upon instantaneous responses and flawless technique. Every morning began with the careful ritual of donning armor, each piece positioned and secured according to specifications developed through generations of trial and error, purchased with the blood of knights who learned too late the fatal consequences of imperfect preparation.
The intimacy of this daily routine created a bond between knight and squire that transcended normal human relationships. William learned to read Sir Geoffrey's moods and intentions with supernatural accuracy, understanding that his own survival often depended upon correctly interpreting subtle changes in posture or expression. More importantly, he absorbed through constant exposure the mental habits and reflexive responses that distinguish professional warriors from amateur fighters. The knight's consciousness, shaped by decades of violent encounter, operated according to principles that prioritized tactical advantage over moral consideration at every decision point. Sir Geoffrey's instruction extended far beyond the technical aspects of combat to encompass the psychological dimensions that determine victory and defeat in human conflict. William learned that the most successful knights achieved their objectives through careful management of their reputations, understanding that fear represented a force multiplier more powerful than additional weapons or armor.
A knight known for absolute ruthlessness might accomplish through threat alone what others required actual violence to achieve. The systematic cultivation of terrifying reputation thus became not merely useful but essential to efficient operation within the medieval power structure. The boy's education in these subtleties proceeded through direct observation of his master's interactions with various social classes. He watched Sir Geoffrey's behavior toward fellow knights, marked by careful courtesy that nonetheless carried implicit threats for those who might mistake politeness for weakness. He observed the knight's treatment of merchants and craftsmen, a studied combination of casual dominance and calculated restraint designed to extract maximum benefit while avoiding unnecessary resistance. Most instructively, he witnessed his master's approach to peasants and common soldiers, interactions that demonstrated how effective intimidation could eliminate the need for repeated applications of force. William's first major campaign as a squire arrived with the onset of spring in his 16th year, when political tensions between England and France erupted into the open warfare that had characterized relations between the two kingdoms for generations. Earl Bigod received summons to assemble his military household for service in Normandy, where English territorial claims required defense against French incursions backed by superior numbers and increasingly sophisticated siege techniques. The expedition would provide William with his first exposure to large-scale military operations and the opportunities for advancement that such conflicts traditionally offered to ambitious young warriors.
The journey across the English Channel unfolded in vessels designed more for the transportation of cargo than human passengers, their holds packed with knights, horses, and the massive quantities of equipment necessary to sustain a military campaign in hostile territory. William spent the crossing wedged between destraries whose nervous energy reflected their master's anticipation of impending combat. The air below decks carried a mixture of human and animal sweat, leather polish, and the metallic scent of weapons oil that would forever afterward trigger memories of this first expedition to foreign battlefields. Landing at Barfleur, William encountered for the first time the logistical complexities that transformed warfare from individual combat into organized destruction on a massive scale. The English forces included not merely knights and their immediate retinues, but thousands of supporting personnel. Archers whose skill with the longbow had revolutionized battlefield tactics. Engineers capable of constructing and operating sophisticated siege equipment, and the countless servants, cooks, and craftsmen necessary to maintain an army in fighting condition across extended campaigns. The castle of Chateau Gaillard, that magnificent fortification constructed by Richard the Lionheart to guard the approaches to Rouen, served as the expedition's initial objective. French forces under Philip Augustus had besieged the stronghold for nearly 8 months, employing innovative techniques that threatened to breach defenses previously considered impregnable. The English relief force faced the daunting task of breaking the siege while simultaneously avoiding the larger French army that controlled most of the surrounding countryside.
William's role in the campaign began modestly, as befitted his status as an untested squire. But the chaotic nature of medieval warfare provided ambitious young men with opportunities to distinguish themselves through exceptional courage or tactical innovation. His assignment to the reconnaissance force that probed French positions gave him first-hand exposure to the deadly game of thrust and parry that characterized military operations at the highest level. Each sortie beyond English lines carried the possibility of sudden, violent death, yet also offered the chance to demonstrate the qualities that might earn him advancement to full knightly status. The French defenders proved worthy opponents, their skill and determination testing every aspect of William's training, while revealing gaps in his preparation that could prove fatal if not addressed immediately. His first encounter with enemy knights taught him that combat against professional equals differed fundamentally from the one-sided violence he had previously experienced against peasants and bandits. These opponents possessed training equivalent to his own, equipment of comparable quality, and the desperate motivation that comes from fighting for survival on familiar ground. The engagement occurred during a dawn raid on French supply lines, when William's reconnaissance force encountered a patrol of enemy knights returning from a similar mission behind English lines. The initial contact erupted with sudden violence as both groups realized simultaneously that retreat would expose them to attack from horsemen whose mounts provided devastating advantages in pursuit of fleeing enemies.
The combat that followed tested every skill William had developed while introducing him to aspects of warfare that no amount of training could fully prepare him to face. His opponent, a French knight whose scarred face testified to years of successful violence, fought with the calculating efficiency of a man whose survival had depended upon superior technique applied under extreme pressure. The enemy's sword work displayed a fluidity and precision that forced William to draw upon reserves of skill he had not known he possessed, while his tactical awareness prevented the young squire from exploiting the few openings that presented themselves during their deadly dance. For the first time in his life, William faced a man whose death would require every ounce of ability he could summon, whose continued existence threatened his own with mathematical certainty. The duel's resolution came not through superior swordplay, but through William's willingness to employ tactics that more honorable opponents might consider beneath their dignity. A deliberately stumbled retreat drew the French knight into overextending his attack, creating the momentary vulnerability that William exploited with a thrust that found the gap between helmet and gorget. The enemy's death, when it came, arrived not through heroic single combat, but through calculated deception that prioritized effectiveness over chivalric ideals. The campaign's progression through the summer months provided William with additional opportunities to refine his skills while observing the broader strategic principles that governed medieval warfare.
He learned that successful military operations depended not merely on individual combat prowess, but on the systematic application of coordinated force designed to break enemy resistance through psychological as well as physical means. The most effective commanders achieved their objectives by convincing opponents that continued resistance would prove more costly than submission, avoiding, whenever possible, the wasteful expenditure of resources that prolonged fighting inevitably required. The siege of Chateau Galard itself demonstrated these principles with terrifying clarity as both sides employed increasingly desperate measures to achieve their objectives. The French besiegers, recognizing that direct assault against the castle's massive walls would prove prohibitively expensive, instead focused their efforts on starving the garrison into submission through systematic destruction of the surrounding countryside. English relief attempts had to contend not merely with enemy soldiers, but with the horrific spectacle of civilian populations caught between competing military forces, their suffering serving as deliberate tools in the larger strategic confrontation. William's participation in these operations completed his education in the moral dimensions of knightly service, teaching him that effective warriors must suppress natural human responses of compassion and empathy that interfere with tactical decision-making. The villages burned during foraging expeditions, the merchants executed for suspected collaboration with enemy forces, and the peasants driven from their homes to deny resources to opposing armies all represented necessary costs of maintaining English territorial claims. Their individual deaths and collective suffering served the greater good of preserving aristocratic dominance against foreign challenges.
The campaign's climax arrived with the French decision to attempt a direct assault on Château Gaillard's outer defenses, recognizing that winter's approach would force them to either capture the fortress or abandon the siege until spring provided more favorable conditions. The attack, when it came, unfolded with a violence and intensity that dwarfed anything William had previously witnessed, as thousands of men hurled themselves against stone walls, defended by opponents equally desperate to maintain their positions. William's assignment to the relief force that attempted to break the French assault lines provided him with his most significant opportunity to demonstrate the qualities necessary for advancement to full knighthood. Leading a small group of men-at-arms in an attack on enemy siege engines, he displayed the combination of tactical awareness, personal courage, and ruthless efficiency that Earl Bigod sought in his knights. The successful destruction of 2 mangonels and the execution of their crews earned William recognition as a warrior worthy of the spurs and sword that would mark his transition to full membership in the aristocratic military elite. The ceremony that elevated William to knighthood took place not in the peaceful surroundings of a castle chapel, but on a muddy battlefield where recent combat had left the ground soaked with blood and scattered with the debris of violent death. Earl Bigod himself performed the ritual, his sword touching William's shoulders in the ancient gesture that transformed Squire into knight, while the sounds of continued fighting echoed from nearby sections of the siege lines.
The prayers that accompanied the ceremony asked for divine blessing on weapons that would be used to kill fellow Christians, while the oaths sworn by the new knight pledged him to service that would inevitably require the systematic application of violence against anyone who challenged English interests. The golden spurs that marked William's new status had been stripped from the body of a French knight killed during the previous day's fighting, their bloodstains carefully cleaned away, but their symbolic significance unchanged by their violent provenance. The sword that Earl Bigod belted around William's waist bore on its blade the nicks and scratches that testified to its effectiveness in combat, each mark representing a life ended through superior skill and determination. The mail hauberk that protected his torso had been fashioned by armorers whose reputation depended upon their product's ability to turn aside enemy weapons while allowing their wearers to deal death with surgical precision. Sir William de Brose, as he was now entitled to call himself, represented the successful completion of a process that had consumed nearly a decade of systematic conditioning and training. The 8-year-old child who had arrived at Earl Bigod's castle no longer existed except as dim memory, replaced by a human weapon whose reflexes, instincts, and moral framework had been shaped according to specifications developed through generations of successful violence.
His education in the techniques of domination and destruction had proceeded with scientific precision, each lesson building upon previous knowledge to create a warrior capable of imposing aristocratic will upon anyone unfortunate enough to oppose him. The newly made knights' return to England coincided with the onset of winter, when military campaigns traditionally ceased to allow armies to recover from the casualties and exhaustion inevitable in extended warfare. Sir William employed this respite to consolidate his position within Earl Bigod's military household, while planning for the territorial grants and marriage alliance that would provide him with the independent power base necessary for long-term success. His reputation, established through demonstrated competence in combat and unwavering loyalty to his superiors, attracted favorable attention from nobles seeking reliable subordinates for increasingly complex political and military challenges. The lands eventually granted to Sir William as reward for his service consisted of 3 villages in Yorkshire, whose previous lord had died without male heirs, leaving his properties available for redistribution to worthy recipients. The manor house that served as the administrative center for these holdings sat atop a hill that commanded views of the surrounding countryside, its stone walls and defensive towers designed to withstand siege while projecting an image of permanent authority over the local population. The peasants who worked the land understood immediately that their new lord represented a return to the harsh efficiency that had characterized aristocratic rule throughout the region.
Sir William's marriage to Lady Eleanor de Montfort, arranged through negotiations that balanced political advantage against financial considerations, provided him with additional territories while cementing alliances that would prove crucial during future conflicts. The ceremony itself, conducted with appropriate pomp in the Earl's private chapel, represented not merely the union of 2 individuals, but the consolidation of resources and influence that strengthened the entire aristocratic network to which both families belonged. The bride's dowry included not only gold and land, but also the military service of knights whose loyalty transferred to her husband through the bonds of feudal obligation.
The establishment of Sir William's independent household marked the completion of his transformation from dependent squire to autonomous lord, capable of exercising life and death authority over hundreds of subordinates, while contributing to the larger system of aristocratic dominance that maintained social order throughout the realm. His daily routine now included not merely personal training and military service, but the administrative responsibilities that came with territorial control, the collection of taxes and rents, the dispensation of justice through manorial courts, and the maintenance of military forces ready to respond to royal summons for service in future campaigns. The peasants who worked Sir William's land quickly learned that their new lord possessed neither patience for inefficiency nor tolerance for anything that might be construed as disrespect.
His responses to perceived challenges to his authority demonstrated the same calculating brutality that had characterized his approach to battlefield opponents, while his rewards for exceptional service reflected understanding that effective leadership required both punishment for failure and incentives for success. The balance he struck between oppression and encouragement produced agricultural yields and tax revenues that impressed even his most experienced neighbors. Sir William's reputation as a knight whose word could be trusted and whose sword could not be safely challenged spread throughout Yorkshire and beyond, attracting requests for military service from nobles engaged in disputes that required resolution through superior force. His participation in these conflicts, whether as principal combatant or hired supporter, provided additional opportunities to demonstrate the skills that had earned him his current position while generating the wealth necessary to maintain his household in appropriate style. Each successful campaign added to his renown while expanding the network of obligations and alliances that defined his place within the aristocratic hierarchy. By his 25th birthday, Sir William de Braose had achieved the position for which his entire life had been designed, that of an autonomous lord whose authority derived from demonstrated competence in violence and whose continued success depended upon maintaining that reputation through consistent application of superior force. The system that had shaped him from childhood had produced exactly the result it intended: a human weapon whose every instinct prioritized dominance over mercy, efficiency over compassion, and tactical advantage over moral consideration.
In confronting such a creature, ordinary people faced not merely a man in armor, but the concentrated essence of aristocratic power, refined through generations of selective breeding and systematic training. Deep beneath the rolling fields of Towton in Yorkshire, where wildflowers now nod gently in summer breezes and sheep graze peacefully among ancient earthworks, lies buried evidence of a horror so profound that it challenges every romanticized notion of medieval chivalry and knightly honor. Here, in the spring of 1461, the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil transformed a pastoral landscape into a charnel house that would haunt the collective memory of a nation for centuries to come. Yet it is only through the patient work of modern archaeologists, their careful brushes and measuring tools revealing secrets that historical documents deliberately obscured, that we begin to understand the true nature of knightly warfare and why intelligent people fled rather than faced these medieval engines of destruction. Picture, if you will, the scene that greets Dr. Sarah Hainsworth as she kneels beside a carefully excavated skeleton in the gray dawn light of a Yorkshire morning. The bones before her, stained dark by centuries of burial in waterlogged soil, tell a story far more disturbing than any chronicle penned by medieval scribes seeking to glorify their patrons.
Hainsworth's work at Towton, supported by teams of specialists whose combined expertise spans archaeology, forensic pathology, and medieval military history, has produced revelations that force us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of knightly warfare. The mass grave she excavates contains the remains of 37 individuals, ranging in age from teenagers to men in their 60s, all bearing evidence of violence so extreme that it challenges the imagination. These were not deaths that occurred in the heat of battle between equally matched opponents, but systematic executions carried out with the cold efficiency of an abattoir. The archaeological evidence reveals patterns of injury that illuminate the terrifying effectiveness of knightly weapons when employed against opponents lacking equivalent protection and training. Sword cuts that cleaved entirely through vertebrae, separating heads from bodies with surgical precision. mace blows that pulverized rib cages, driving fragments of bone deep into vital organs, polearm thrusts that punched through mail and padding to emerge from victims' backs, the force of impact sufficient to lift grown men from their feet before hurling them to the ground like discarded dolls. Yet perhaps most revealing are the defensive wounds, or rather, their almost complete absence from the skeletal remains. Unlike modern homicide victims, who typically display cuts on hands and arms sustained while attempting to ward off their attackers, these medieval casualties show virtually no evidence of successful defense.
This individual, designated SK-16 in her meticulous records, bears the unmistakable marks of violence so extreme and systematic that it defies conventional understanding of medieval combat as individual dueling between armored opponents. The skull, fragmented into dozens of pieces that required weeks of painstaking reconstruction, displays no fewer than 13 separate impact wounds, each one potentially fatal, yet delivered with such rapid succession that the victim clearly had no opportunity to defend himself or retreat from his attackers. The largest wound, a crushing blow that caved in the entire left side of the cranium, was delivered by what forensic analysis reveals to be a heavy mace or warhammer wielded with tremendous force by someone attacking from horseback. Yet this devastating injury, which would have killed instantly, represents merely the beginning of a systematic destruction that continued even after death had already claimed its victim. Additional wounds cluster around the face and jaw, delivered by what appeared to be multiple different weapons wielded by several attackers who continued their assault long after any military necessity had passed. The pattern of injuries suggests not combat, but execution, a deliberate and methodical destruction of human life that transformed killing from military action into ritualistic brutality. Most disturbing of all, microscopic analysis of the bone damage reveals that many of these wounds were inflicted after death, as if the attackers were not merely destroying enemies, but expressing some deeper psychological need to obliterate their victims' very humanity.
Their arms remained at their sides, their hands unmarked by blade contact, their postures suggesting not combat, but submission in the face of overwhelming force. These people died not fighting, but fleeing, cut down from behind by pursuers whose superior mobility and weaponry made escape impossible. The soil itself tells part of this story through chemical analysis that reveals the presence of organic compounds associated with massive blood loss, creating a subsurface layer that archaeologists have learned to recognize as the signature of medieval battlefields. But buried within this matrix of death lie artifacts that provide even more disturbing insights into the reality of knightly warfare. Arrowheads bent and twisted from impact with human bone, sword fragments snapped by the force of repeated blows against unyielding targets, belt buckles and clothing fasteners that reveal how victims were stripped of valuables even as they lay dying in the mud. The discovery of children's remains among the dead provides perhaps the most chilling evidence of knightly ruthlessness. These young people, some no older than 12 or 13, bear the same pattern of fatal injuries as their adult companions, suggesting that knights made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants when bloodlust overcame whatever restraint their training might have imposed. The systematic nature of these killings, evidenced by the careful arrangement of bodies within the mass grave, suggests that the murders were not spontaneous acts of violence, but calculated decisions to eliminate potential witnesses or future sources of rebellion.
Archaeological investigation of medieval castle sites provides additional evidence of the brutal efficiency with which knights maintained their dominance over subject populations. Excavations at Sandal Castle in West Yorkshire have uncovered execution grounds where the soil chemistry reveals decades of systematic killing, while refuse pits contain the remains of individuals who died under circumstances that historical documents euphemistically describe as judicial proceedings, but which forensic evidence suggests were torture sessions conducted with scientific precision. The weapons recovered from these sites bear modification marks that reveal how knights adapted their equipment for maximum effectiveness against unarmored opponents. Sword blades, ground to razor sharpness, their edges honed to slice through flesh and bone with minimal resistance. Mace heads, studded with additional spikes, designed to penetrate mail and create wounds that would prove impossible to treat with medieval medical techniques. Polearms, fitted with hooks and barbs, intended not merely to kill, but to prevent victims from escaping once struck.
Most revealing of all are the specialized tools discovered in contexts, suggesting they were used not for combat, but for interrogation and execution. These implements, crafted with the same attention to detail that characterized knightly weapons, were designed to inflict maximum pain while preventing death until information had been extracted or confessions obtained. Their presence in castle armories alongside conventional military equipment suggests that torture represented a routine aspect of knightly administration rather than an exceptional measure reserved for extraordinary circumstances.
The study of medieval horse remains provides additional insights into the overwhelming advantages that mounted knights enjoyed over opponents fighting on foot. The destriers, whose bones litter battlefield excavations, were massive animals, some standing nearly 18 hands at the shoulder and weighing well over a ton, bred specifically for their ability to carry armored riders at high speeds while simultaneously serving as weapons in their own right. The trauma patterns visible on human remains show clear evidence of trampling injuries inflicted by iron-shod hooves, suggesting that many victims died not from deliberate weapon strikes, but from being crushed beneath the weight of charging war horses. Examination of knight burials reveals the extraordinary investments in equipment and training that created these medieval super warriors. A single knight's grave from Tewkesbury Abbey contains armor and weapons representing more wealth than most villages would see in a generation, each piece crafted by master artisans whose skills had been refined through generations of practical experience in creating instruments of human destruction. The sword alone, forged from steel of exceptional quality and balance, would have required months of work by specialists whose reputation depended upon their product's effectiveness in actual combat. The metallurgical analysis of these weapons reveals technological sophistication that challenges assumptions about medieval craftsmanship and scientific knowledge. The steel used in knightly swords displays carbon content and tempering techniques that would not be rediscovered by civilian industries for centuries, suggesting that military applications drove technological advancement far beyond what was available for peaceful purposes.
The edge geometry of these blades, optimized through trial and error across countless battles, achieved efficiency in cutting that modern computer modeling can barely improve upon. Archaeological evidence from training facilities associated with major castles illuminates the systematic nature of knightly education and the scientific approach to developing human-killing machines. Practice grounds reveal impact patterns from thousands of repetitions with various weapons, while the remains of training equipment show wear patterns that document the relentless physical conditioning required to transform young nobles into effective instruments of violence. Quintains, mechanical training devices designed to strike back if hit incorrectly, bear damage from decades of use by generations of aspiring knights. The examination of medieval medical texts and surgical instruments provides additional context for understanding why confronting knights represented such a hopeless proposition for ordinary people. The surgical techniques described in these documents, developed specifically to treat battlefield injuries, reveal intimate familiarity with the types of wounds that knightly weapons inflicted with regular predictability. The instruments themselves, crafted with precision that rivals modern surgical tools, were designed to extract arrowheads embedded in bone, repair organs punctured by sword thrusts, and amputate limbs mangled by mace blows. Yet perhaps most telling is what these medical documents do not contain: any effective treatments for the psychological trauma that resulted from witnessing or surviving knightly violence. The physical wounds might heal, given sufficient time and care, but the mental scars left by encounters with these medieval killing machines apparently received no systematic attention from medieval physicians. The silence of medical literature on this subject suggests that psychological injury was considered either irrelevant or inevitable, a natural consequence of living in a world where armored predators roamed freely among helpless prey. The archaeological record also reveals evidence of the economic systems that supported knightly dominance, showing how entire communities were organized around the single purpose of maintaining these expensive weapons of war. Castle excavations uncover workshops where specialists devoted their entire lives to crafting and maintaining the equipment that made knightly superiority possible. Armorer shops contain tools and materials representing technological capabilities far in advance of anything available to civilian craftsmen, while weapon-making facilities display evidence of production methods that prioritized effectiveness over economy.
The remains of horses found in castle stables reveal the enormous resources devoted to breeding and training the mounts that provided knights with their crucial mobility advantages. These animals, fed on grain that could have supported dozens of peasant families, received medical care that exceeded what was available to most human beings. Their skeletons show evidence of deliberate conditioning designed to maximize their effectiveness as instruments of war, while their burial contexts suggest they were valued more highly than the human beings who served their knightly masters.
Analysis of medieval diet through esoteric examination of skeletal remains reveals the stark nutritional differences between knights and the populations they ruled. The noble warriors consumed high-protein diets rich in meat and dairy products, developing the physical strength and stamina necessary for effective combat, while their subjects subsisted on grain-based foods that left them malnourished and physically inferior. This dietary disparity created biological advantages that reinforced social hierarchies, ensuring that knights remained physically superior to anyone who might contemplate resistance. The patterns of settlement revealed through archaeological survey work show how entire landscapes were organized around the principle of knightly dominance, with castle placement and road networks designed to maximize the effectiveness of mounted warriors while minimizing opportunities for resistance or escape. Villages were positioned within easy striking distance of fortified strongholds, while major thoroughfares were engineered to accommodate rapid deployment of cavalry forces to any location where trouble might develop. Perhaps most chilling of all are the mass graves discovered at sites throughout Europe, containing the remains of entire communities that apparently challenged knightly authority and paid the ultimate price for their audacity. These burial contexts reveal systematic killing on scales that challenge comprehension, suggesting that knights were capable of genocidal violence when circumstances required such extreme measures. The careful arrangement of bodies within these graves indicates that the murders were conducted with methodical precision rather than spontaneous brutality, while the absence of valuable artifacts suggests that victims were robbed as well as killed.
The archaeological evidence from these sites forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of medieval society and the reality of life under knightly rule. The romantic vision of chivalrous warriors protecting innocent civilians dissolves when confronted with forensic proof of systematic oppression maintained through calculated brutality. The bones speak more honestly than any chronicle, their trauma patterns revealing the true cost of aristocratic privilege measured in human suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. Beneath the weathered stones of Conisbrough Castle in South Yorkshire, hidden within walls that have stood silent for 8 centuries, lies a chamber that no medieval chronicler ever described and no troubadour ever celebrated in song. This room, discovered only through ground-penetrating radar and painstaking archaeological investigation, contains artifacts that illuminate aspects of knightly culture so disturbing that contemporary scribes apparently conspired to erase them from historical memory. Here, in a space deliberately concealed from casual observation, we find evidence of the systematic study of human destruction that transformed medieval warfare from crude brawling into precise science. The chamber's walls bear inscriptions that represent the earliest known attempts at creating what we might recognize today as military field manuals, detailed analyses of weapon effectiveness against various types of armor and protection.
These texts, carved directly into stone to ensure their preservation, describe with clinical precision the optimal angles for sword thrusts to penetrate mail, the specific techniques for using war hammers to crush skulls through helmets, and the proper methods for employing polearms to disable mounted opponents while minimizing risk to the attacker. The language employed is disturbingly objective, treating human targets as engineering problems to be solved rather than fellow beings deserving consideration or mercy. Most remarkable among these inscriptions are detailed anatomical diagrams that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human physiology and the most efficient methods for exploiting bodily vulnerabilities in combat. These illustrations, obviously created by individuals with extensive practical experience in human dissection, show precisely where blades must be directed to sever major blood vessels, disable limb function, or cause immediate death.
The accuracy of these diagrams rivals that found in medical texts from centuries later, suggesting that knights possessed scientific knowledge far in advance of what was available to civilian physicians or scholars.
A crossbow mechanism modified to fire multiple bolts simultaneously, creating a spray pattern that made evasion virtually impossible for opponents fighting on foot. These experimental weapons bear modification marks and usage wear that indicate extensive field testing, suggesting that knights approached the development of new killing technologies with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized their training regimens. Notes carved alongside the weapon storage areas describe the specific circumstances under which each design proved most effective, while also documenting the weaknesses and limitations discovered through practical application. The tone of these observations remains consistently clinical, as if the authors were conducting scientific experiments rather than developing methods for ending human lives. Perhaps most chilling of all are the detailed records of what appear to be systematic studies of fear and psychological manipulation conducted by knights seeking to maximize their effectiveness without necessarily having to engage in actual combat. These documents, written on vellum that has somehow survived the centuries in the chamber's controlled environment, describe techniques for projecting intimidation through posture, voice modulation, and equipment display that could cause opponents to surrender or flee without physical confrontation. The psychological insights contained within these texts demonstrate understanding of human nature that would not be formally codified by academic psychology for centuries to come. The study of medieval armor through advanced imaging techniques has revealed technological sophistication that challenges every assumption about the limitations of pre-industrial craftsmanship.
X-ray analysis of mail hauberks shows that individual rings were not simply hammered closed, but welded, using techniques that created joints stronger than the metal itself, ensuring that properly constructed mail could turn aside sword thrusts that would penetrate inferior protection. The precision required for this level of metalwork suggests that armorer guilds possessed closely guarded trade secrets that elevated their craft to levels approaching modern engineering standards. Advanced metallurgical analysis of knightly swords reveals even more remarkable technological achievements hidden beneath centuries of rust and corrosion. The steel employed in the finest blades displays carbon distribution patterns that indicate controlled heat treatment processes capable of creating different hardness zones within a single weapon. The cutting edge, hardened to maintain sharpness through extended combat, transitions smoothly to a softer spine that provides flexibility and shock absorption. This differential hardening, achieved through techniques that would not be rediscovered until the Industrial Revolution, created weapons that combined seemingly contradictory properties of hardness and resilience. The discovery of what appears to be a medieval testing facility hidden beneath Warwick Castle provides unprecedented insights into the systematic approach knights took toward weapon development and quality control. The underground chambers contain mechanical devices designed to simulate combat stresses, allowing armorers to test their products under controlled conditions before trusting them in actual battle. Impact testing apparatus that could deliver precise, repeatable strikes against armor samples. Flexibility machines that bent sword blades through predetermined arcs to verify their resilience.
Even early forms of metallurgical furnaces, capable of analyzing metal composition through controlled heating and observation of spark patterns. The records associated with this facility, written in Latin and Norman French, describe testing procedures that rival modern industrial quality assurance programs in their thoroughness and scientific approach. Each piece of equipment underwent standardized evaluation according to criteria that balanced effectiveness, durability, and weight considerations. Weapons that failed to meet established performance standards were either returned to their makers for improvement or destroyed to prevent their deployment in combat situations where lives might depend upon their reliability.
Archaeological investigation of castle workshops has revealed the existence of medieval research and development programs focused on improving the effectiveness of siege warfare technologies. Hidden beneath the ruins of Rochester Castle, excavators have uncovered the remains of what appears to be an engineering laboratory, where specialists developed increasingly sophisticated methods for breaching fortifications while defending against similar attacks. Scale models of castle walls, constructed with meticulous attention to authentic materials and building techniques, bear the scars of experiments with various siege engines and projectile weapons. The notebooks discovered alongside these models contain detailed observations about the relative effectiveness of different stone types for construction, the optimal thickness for walls designed to resist specific siege weapons, and the strategic placement of defensive features to maximize their psychological as well as practical impact on attackers. Most remarkably, these documents include what appeared to be early attempts at mathematical analysis of siege warfare, with calculations designed to determine the optimal trajectory angles for catapult projectiles and the precise force requirements for battering rams to breach gates of various thicknesses. The examination of medieval horse breeding records through DNA analysis of preserved remains has revealed the existence of systematic programs designed to create war horses whose capabilities far exceeded those of ordinary riding animals. These breeding initiatives, conducted with scientific rigor that would not be formally recognized until centuries later, selected for specific traits that maximized effectiveness in mounted combat. Size and strength sufficient to carry a fully armored knight at high speeds. Temperament aggressive enough to serve as a weapon while remaining controllable under battlefield conditions. Intelligence adequate to respond to subtle commands even in the chaos of combat. The genetic diversity present in medieval destrier populations suggests that horse breeders maintained detailed records of bloodlines and carefully planned matings to concentrate desirable traits while avoiding the inbreeding that might weaken their stock. The skeletal remains of these animals show evidence of deliberate conditioning programs designed to maximize their physical capabilities while minimizing the risk of injury that might compromise their military value. Specialized feeding regimens, evidenced through chemical analysis of preserved organic matter, provided nutrition calculated to optimize muscle development and bone density.
Perhaps most disturbing are the archaeological traces of what appears to have been systematic psychological conditioning programs designed to eliminate normal human responses of empathy and compassion that might interfere with effective violence. Excavations at several castle sites have uncovered chambers that seem to have served no practical purpose other than as locations where young knights underwent experiences designed to desensitize them to human suffering. These rooms contain evidence of activities that pushed the boundaries of medieval psychological understanding while achieving objectives that modern military training programs would recognize as essential for creating effective killers. The artifacts recovered from these conditioning chambers include implements obviously designed for causing pain without inflicting permanent physical damage, suggesting that aspiring knights underwent systematic torture as part of their education in both giving and receiving violence. The arrangement of these chambers, always located in the deepest and most secure parts of castle complexes, indicates that the activities conducted within them were considered too sensitive for general knowledge. Even servants and lower-ranking personnel were apparently excluded from these areas, creating an inner sanctum where only the most trusted individuals could witness the transformation of young nobles into instruments of destruction. Written records associated with these psychological conditioning programs, discovered in secret compartments within castle walls, describe techniques for breaking down normal human emotional responses and rebuilding them according to specifications that prioritized tactical effectiveness over moral consideration.
The methods described include systematic exposure to increasing levels of violence, beginning with the torture of animals and progressing through the execution of prisoners to the massacre of civilian populations. Each phase of this conditioning was carefully calibrated to push subjects beyond their previous limits, while ensuring that they remained functional rather than psychologically destroyed.
The discovery of what appears to be medieval medical experimentation facilities provides additional evidence of the scientific approach knights took toward understanding and exploiting human vulnerability. These laboratories, hidden within castle complexes and accessible only through concealed passages, contain equipment obviously designed for conducting systematic studies of human anatomy and physiology. Dissection tables equipped with restraining mechanisms that allowed for detailed examination of living subjects. Surgical instruments designed not for healing, but for exploring the limits of human endurance and the specific conditions that cause death. The notebooks recovered from these facilities contain observations that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human biology achieved through methods that violated every principle of medieval medical ethics. Detailed descriptions of how different types of weapons create specific injury patterns. Systematic analysis of the relationship between wound location and survival time. Even early attempts at what we might recognize today as psychological profiling, with descriptions of how different personality types respond to various forms of physical and mental stress. Most remarkably, these documents include evidence of experimental programs designed to enhance human performance for combat applications. Dietary modifications intended to increase strength and endurance.
Training regimens that pushed subjects beyond normal physical limits. Even crude attempts at what might be considered early forms of performance-enhancing drugs using herbal preparations whose effects were carefully observed and documented for future reference. The level of systematic investigation revealed by these records suggests that medieval knights possessed scientific capabilities far beyond what conventional historical sources would suggest. The archaeological evidence for medieval intelligence-gathering operations provides another dimension to understanding how knights maintained their dominance over subject populations. Hidden compartments within castle walls contain the remnants of sophisticated surveillance networks that monitored civilian activities with paranoid attention to detail. Maps marking the locations of potential dissidents. Detailed genealogies tracking family relationships that might indicate hereditary disloyalty. And extensive records of economic transactions that could reveal hidden wealth or unauthorized commerce. The techniques described in these intelligence documents demonstrate understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that would not be formally codified until the modern era. Methods for identifying potential leaders among subject populations before they could organize resistance movements. Techniques for sowing discord within communities to prevent the development of unified opposition to knightly rule. Even systematic approaches to recruiting informants whose loyalty could be purchased through carefully calibrated combinations of reward and intimidation. These intelligence networks apparently operated with efficiency that rivaled modern security organizations, maintaining surveillance over vast geographic areas through carefully coordinated networks of agents and informants.
The records indicate that every significant population center contained individuals whose primary loyalty lay with their knightly overlords rather than their immediate communities, creating a web of observation that made organized resistance virtually impossible to sustain for any extended period. In the depths of Canterbury Cathedral's crypt, hidden beneath centuries of accumulated debris and forgotten by all but the most dedicated archaeological researchers, lies a chamber that challenges every assumption about the relationship between medieval Christianity and knightly violence. The walls of this forgotten sanctum bear frescoes that were deliberately obscured by later generations, their disturbing imagery apparently deemed too dangerous or controversial for public viewing. These paintings, revealed through painstaking restoration work, depict religious ceremonies that blur the boundaries between sacred worship and systematic preparation for human slaughter. The central fresco shows what appears to be a knighting ceremony, conducted not in the bright splendor of a cathedral nave, but in the shadowy confines of this underground chamber. The participants, their faces painted with expressions of religious ecstasy rather than martial determination, engage in rituals that bear disturbing similarities to practices associated with mystery cults and secret societies. Knights kneel before altars decorated with weapons rather than traditional Christian symbols, while priests
whose vestments incorporate military heraldry, conduct ceremonies that seem designed to consecrate violence rather than promote peace.
Most remarkable among these images is a detailed depiction of what scholars have tentatively identified as a weapon blessing ritual, far more elaborate and theologically complex than any ceremony described in conventional medieval sources. The painting shows knights presenting their swords, maces, and other implements of war for individual consecration through procedures that apparently required hours of careful preparation and invocation. Each weapon receives treatment more appropriate to holy relics than military equipment, suggesting that knightly culture developed theological frameworks that transformed instruments of destruction into objects of religious veneration. The Latin inscriptions surrounding these frescoes contain prayers and invocations that demonstrate sophisticated theological reasoning applied to the justification of systematic violence. These texts, composed in elegant ecclesiastical Latin by scholars obviously well-versed in Christian doctrine, present arguments for the divine mandate of knightly rule that go far beyond conventional just war theory. They describe knights as instruments of God's wrath, specifically created to impose divine order upon a fallen world through the systematic application of sanctified force. Archaeological investigation of other cathedral crypts throughout Europe has revealed that Canterbury's hidden chamber represents not an isolated aberration, but part of a widespread network of secret religious sites where knightly culture developed its own distinctive theological traditions. These underground sanctuaries, connected by passages that allowed discrete movement between different parts of cathedral complexes, apparently served as locations where the most sensitive aspects of knightly religious practice could be conducted away from the scrutiny of civilian clergy and common worshippers.
The artifacts recovered from these hidden chambers include religious objects that blend Christian symbolism with martial imagery in ways that suggest the development of distinctly knightly forms of worship. Crucifixes, whose arms have been shaped to resemble sword hilts, their surfaces decorated with inscriptions that celebrate the sanctity of righteous violence. Chalices, whose bowls bear engravings depicting battle scenes, transforming the central ritual of Christian worship into a celebration of military triumph. Even prayer books, whose illuminated manuscripts contain detailed tactical instructions interspersed with conventional religious devotions. The discovery of what appears to be a medieval military chaplain's private library within the walls of Durham Cathedral provides unprecedented insights into the theological framework that justified and sustained knightly violence. The texts contained within this hidden collection, carefully preserved through centuries of concealment, include treatises on military ethics that push the boundaries of Christian moral philosophy while maintaining theological respectability through sophisticated scholastic argumentation. These works present systematic justifications for practices that conventional Christian doctrine would condemn as sins against divine law. Most disturbing among these theological works are detailed manuals for conducting religious services specifically designed to prepare knights for maximum effectiveness in combat situations. These liturgies, obviously created by scholars with extensive knowledge of both Christian doctrine and military psychology, incorporate prayers, readings, and ritual actions calculated to induce psychological states conducive to efficient killing. The ceremonies described include specific invocations designed to suppress natural human responses of mercy and compassion, while enhancing aggressive instincts and tactical awareness. The examination of knightly tomb inscriptions through advanced imaging techniques has revealed hidden layers of text that were apparently considered too controversial for general viewing but too important for complete omission from funerary monuments. These concealed inscriptions, visible only through specialized photographic methods that can detect traces of paint and gilding invisible to the naked eye, contain references to achievements and activities that conventional medieval chroniclers deliberately ignored or euphemistically described. One particularly revealing example, discovered on the tomb of Sir Geoffrey de Mandeville in the Temple Church, includes detailed descriptions of tactical innovations that the knight developed during his campaigns against civilian populations in the fenlands of East Anglia. The hidden text celebrates not merely his military victories, but his specific contributions to the science of systematic intimidation, including techniques for psychological warfare that proved so effective that entire regions submitted without physical resistance. The tone of these inscriptions treats mass terror as a legitimate military achievement worthy of commemoration alongside more conventional martial accomplishments. The study of medieval illuminated manuscripts through multispectral imaging has uncovered evidence of systematic censorship programs designed to remove or modify references to the most disturbing aspects of knightly culture. Marginalia that originally contained explicit descriptions of torture techniques have been carefully scraped away and replaced with conventional decorative elements. Illustrations depicting knights engaged in activities deemed inappropriate for general consumption have been painted over with innocuous religious imagery that conceals but does not entirely eliminate the underlying artwork.
These censorship efforts appear to have been conducted not by hostile critics of knightly culture, but by sympathetic scribes seeking to protect sensitive information from unauthorized access, while preserving it for future generations of properly initiated readers. The techniques employed suggest sophisticated understanding of document preservation and the need to maintain multiple layers of meaning within single texts. Casual readers would encounter conventional presentations of knightly virtue, while individuals possessed of appropriate knowledge could decode references to practices that required discretion for both practical and theological reasons. The discovery of medieval military manuals written in elaborate cipher systems provides additional evidence of the secretive nature of advanced knightly training. These coded texts, recovered from castle libraries and monastery scriptoriums throughout Europe, contain tactical and strategic information that apparently required protection from unauthorized access. The encryption methods employed display mathematical sophistication that challenges assumptions about medieval scholarly capabilities, while demonstrating the importance placed upon maintaining the exclusive nature of advanced military knowledge. The content of these deciphered manuals reveals systematic approaches to warfare that prioritized psychological manipulation and terror tactics over conventional combat techniques. Detailed instructions for conducting campaigns designed to break enemy morale through carefully calibrated applications of exemplary violence. Strategic principles that recognized the economic efficiency of intimidation compared to prolonged military operations. Even early forms of what might be recognized today as propaganda warfare, with specific techniques for managing information flow to maximize the psychological impact of military actions.
Archaeological investigation of medieval castle chapels has revealed architectural features that suggest religious services were regularly conducted with the specific purpose of preparing participants for systematic violence. These sacred spaces contain design elements that subtly but unmistakably emphasize martial themes while maintaining the appearance of conventional Christian worship. Altar decorations that incorporate weapon motifs, window designs that filter light through colored glass depicting battle scenes rather than traditional religious imagery. Even acoustic features that enhance the dramatic effect of war prayers and military invocations. The archaeological record reveals evidence of seasonal religious festivals specifically associated with knightly culture, celebrations that marked important events in the military calendar while maintaining the outward appearance of conventional Christian observance. These ceremonies, conducted in castle chapels and private oratories throughout the medieval world, apparently served to reinforce the spiritual foundations of knightly dominance while providing opportunities for the exchange of tactical information and strategic coordination among military elites. The artifacts associated with these knightly religious festivals include specialized liturgical objects that blend sacred and martial symbolism in ways that suggest the development of distinctly military forms of Christian worship. Processional crosses whose designs incorporate weapons rather than conventional religious imagery. Ceremonial armor blessed for ritual rather than practical use. Even religious vestments, whose embroidered decorations celebrate specific military achievements while maintaining theological respectability through sophisticated iconographic programs.
The study of medieval heraldic imagery through computer-assisted analysis has revealed hidden layers of meaning in knightly coat of arms that apparently served as coded references to specific tactical specializations or combat achievements. These symbolic systems, far more complex than conventional heraldic interpretation would suggest, apparently allowed initiated viewers to decode information about individual knights' capabilities, experience, and areas of expertise. The symbols functioned as medieval equivalents of military service ribbons, providing instant recognition of qualifications and achievements while remaining incomprehensible to unauthorized observers.
Most remarkably, the archaeological evidence suggests that medieval knightly culture developed its own distinctive eschatological traditions, theological beliefs about death and afterlife that differed significantly from conventional Christian doctrine while remaining superficially orthodox. These beliefs, preserved in private religious texts and funerary inscriptions, present visions of eternal reward specifically designed for warriors who achieved spiritual perfection through the systematic practice of sanctified violence. The afterlife described in these texts resembles not the peaceful paradise of traditional Christian imagery, but an eternal battlefield where perfected knights continue their sacred mission of imposing divine order through superior force. Picture, if you will, the scene that unfolds on a crisp October morning in the year 1347, as dawn light filters through the diamond-paned windows of Middleham Castle's Great Hall, illuminating a world of privilege and power that exists in almost mythical separation from the daily reality experienced by the vast majority of medieval humanity.
Here, Sir Edmund de Grey breaks his fast at a table laden with delicacies that represent the agricultural output of entire villages. His casual consumption of white bread, aged cheese, and fresh meat, reflecting an abundance that stands in stark contrast to the chronic hunger that defines existence for those who labor to support his lifestyle. The very air within the castle carries scents that proclaim aristocratic privilege to anyone fortunate enough to breathe them. The sweet aroma of expensive spices imported from distant lands at costs that exceed annual peasant incomes. The rich perfume of beeswax candles whose pure flame provides illumination far superior to the tallow dips and rushlights that barely penetrate the darkness of common dwellings. Even the smoke from the great hall's massive fireplace burns with the clean fragrance of seasoned hardwood, carefully selected and transported by servants whose primary responsibility involves ensuring that their noble master never experiences the acrid bite of green timber or inferior fuel. Sir Edmund himself embodies the physical transformation that generations of superior nutrition, medical care, and freedom from manual labor have produced within the aristocratic class. Standing nearly 6 feet in height at a time when common men rarely exceed 5.5 feet, his imposing stature reflects not merely genetic inheritance, but the accumulated advantages that flow from privileged birth.
His teeth, white and relatively straight thanks to access to refined foods and basic dental care, contrast sharply with the blackened stumps and gaps that characterize peasant smiles. His hands, though calloused from weapons training, remain soft compared to the gnarled and permanently stained digits that mark those who work the soil for their survival. The clothing that adorns Sir Edmund's body represents wealth that could feed entire communities for months, while demonstrating technological capabilities that remain beyond the reach of common craftsmen. His tunic, woven from wool so fine that each thread approaches the thinness of silk, displays a uniform deep blue color achieved through dyeing processes that require rare and expensive materials imported from Mediterranean ports. The silver thread that forms decorative patterns along the garment's borders contains more precious metal than most peasants will see in their lifetimes, while the skill required to create such intricate needlework represents years of training available only to artisans who serve exclusively aristocratic clientele. As Sir Edmund moves through his morning routine, every gesture reflects the casual assumption of authority that comes from being born into a world where other human beings exist primarily to serve his needs and desires. Servants appear at his slightest indication of want, their movements choreographed through years of training to anticipate requirements before they are articulated.
The young page who holds his basin and ewer for morning ablutions has learned to read his master's moods with supernatural accuracy, understanding that his own safety depends upon providing perfect service without ever drawing attention to his presence or personality. The clothing that protects Thomas from the elements reveals the desperate economy that governs every aspect of peasant life. His tunic, woven from wool sheared from sheep that graze on Sir Edmund's pastures, displays the natural gray-brown color that comes from using undyed thread, dyeing processes remaining far too expensive for common folk to afford. The garment shows numerous patches where his wife Margaret has carefully repaired tears and holes, using scraps of cloth salvaged from older clothes whose deterioration has finally rendered them unwearable. His hose, knitted from yarn spun by Margaret during the long winter evenings when other work becomes impossible, sag and bag around his legs, their loose fit reflecting both the inferior quality of homespun cloth and the chronic malnutrition that has prevented him from achieving the robust physique that better nutrition might have provided. Margaret herself embodies the harsh toll that peasant life extracts from those unfortunate enough to be born into its grinding poverty. Though only 28 years old, her face bears lines and weathering that make her appear a decade older, while her hands, cracked and swollen from constant exposure to cold water and harsh soap, move with the careful economy of motion that comes from chronic fatigue and inadequate rest.
Her day begins before dawn, with the milking of their single cow, a scrawny beast whose meager production barely provides enough milk for their 3 surviving children, while contributing a small surplus that can be bartered for other necessities. The children themselves, though loved as deeply as any offspring of noble families, face futures constrained by circumstances entirely beyond their control. Young William, age 12, possesses intelligence and curiosity that in different circumstances might have led to scholarly achievement, but his destiny remains fixed by the social class of his birth. His education consists entirely of learning the practical skills necessary for agricultural labor, while his younger siblings, Margaret and John, receive even less formal instruction, their primary preparation for adult life involving the acquisition of sufficient physical strength and endurance to survive the brutal demands that will be placed upon their bodies throughout their working years. The recreational activities available to different social classes reflect broader patterns of privilege and constraint that define medieval social relationships. Sir Edmund's leisure time includes hunting expeditions that serve simultaneously as military training, social networking opportunities, and displays of aristocratic authority over both natural resources and subject populations. The elaborate rituals associated with noble hunting, from the breeding and training of specialized dogs to the complex protocols that govern participation in royal hunts, create exclusive communities that reinforce class solidarity while excluding outsiders from access to both political influence and economic opportunity.
Thomas's occasional moments of leisure, by contrast, remain constrained by the constant pressure of economic necessity and the ever-present awareness that his survival depends upon maintaining the goodwill of aristocratic superiors who might withdraw their protection at any moment. Village festivals, when they occur at all, must receive noble approval and remain subject to immediate cancellation if their timing conflicts with agricultural demands or political considerations deemed more important by those who hold ultimate authority over peasant lives. As the morning progresses and both castle and village settle into their established rhythms, we begin to perceive the subtle mechanisms through which medieval society transformed brutal inequality into accepted natural law. The physical arrangement of the landscape itself serves as a constant reminder of hierarchical relationships, with Sir Edmund's castle positioned on elevated ground that commands visual dominance over the surrounding countryside, while simultaneously providing strategic advantages that make resistance practically impossible. Every peasant working in the fields below must periodically glance upward toward those stone walls, their presence serving as perpetual reminder of the power that shapes and constrains every aspect of common life. The psychological impact of this architectural dominance cannot be overstated, for it creates conditions under which inequality becomes not merely accepted but internalized as fundamental truth about the natural order of human existence. Children born into peasant families grow to adulthood with the castle's towers defining their horizon, their very perception of possibility shaped by the omnipresent reality of aristocratic authority.